So as you probably can tell, I have a little tiny bit of a cold, so please bear with me. But I am very excited about today's topic. It's a topic that I work with other people on, I train on. It's something that it's also a personal topic. It's something that I've encountered. So a little bit about me. I'm Matt Webster. I'm the founder, CEO, and CISO for Cyvergence, a local New York City company. And what I do is I work on basically solving cybersecurity governance. So this means a whole bunch of different things to a lot of different people. But part of this, I do mean things like how do you work with executives? How do you get alignment with executives? How do you deal with the ROI? What does that mean? The cost-benefit analysis. But it also means emotional intelligence, and risk quantification. There's a whole bunch of things that I focus on from that perspective. But the dark triad is something that I personally have dealt with. So this is a personal story that I'm going to be telling today. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we start to go through this. So the agenda today, we're going to be going through introductions, why this talk, defining toxicity, the impacts of toxicity, and your defenses. But before we get started, is there anybody here who has heard of the dark triad prior to this talk? So I see one, but I also know who he is and why he's aware of that. So it's good that you don't, but it's actually not surprising, but it is something that as security leaders, as CISOs, as others, this is something that we should be aware of. And we're going to go into this in just a little bit. So the introductions, I'm going to be telling a lot of stories throughout this training. I think that's, I don't know why that's going. There we go. I'm going to be telling a lot of stories throughout this talk. A lot of these are very personal stories. I will sometimes tell edited stories of others as well. So all this stuff is real. It may seem unreal to some of you. Some of you are gonna be like, yep, I've seen that a million times before, or you're gonna know exactly what I'm talking about. So just kind of keep that in mind. Also keep in mind, this is a very high level conversation. This is not gonna be going into a lot of the details. And really, this topic is a topic that is this big. There is a lot to say about it, but I had to shrink it down and figure out how can I get this down to just the bare bone basics. There is a lot that we're going to be missing from this, but at least it's going to get you a feel of where to get started in this. There will be Q&A at the tail end of this, so just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. That's not working so well. There we go. And so if you have questions in the middle on a particular slide, ask that, but try not to go ahead when you're asking questions. All right, 3 takeaways. How to recognize the sign of narcissism, manipulation, and psychopathy in the workplace. And we'll go into what those are fairly soon. We'll take a look, another takeaway is behavioral structural indicators that you or your team are under social attack. And practical strategies that you can reduce to reduce your exposure, again, a cyber word, set boundaries and protect decision-making processes. So why this talk? We've all seen a lot of these things. CISOs have been under a tremendous amount of stress. I'm a former CISO multiple times over, very comfortable in the role, but also I now recognize just how serious that can be, especially when you're dealing with toxic situations. 59% of CISOs cover stress as a personal risk, burnout for roughly 50% of them. When you talk about stress levels, 88% reported moderate to tremendous. Mental health impact. 48% reported an impact to their mental health and has changed their outlook on life as a result of situations. There's medication and substance abuse. 23% say the CISO role has caused them to seek help. Now, some of this I'm going to assume is authorized. They're doing everything they could, but it sounds like from the article that it's also stepping into some areas where they probably should not be stepping into. So this is something definitely to consider. And when you think about the CISO role, we're in a very unique situation, especially when we're dealing with IT and some of these other contexts. So, for example, we are in part whistleblowers. A lot of IT practitioners, some love us, don't get us wrong. I think that's a great thing. You need to develop those relationships and nurture them and make sure that we're all working on the same page. But in a certain sense, we're whistleblowers. Hey, you did a great job. You're fantastic. But, and that little tiny but is enough to create a lot of challenges in organizations. Sometimes even on your own team. In one organization, somebody had said something that was just really despicable, somebody I was reporting into. I did not say a word. I glanced. That's all I did. I became from the top employee, the fantastic person in the world, into a piece of garbage. 1 second. This is something that you have to do. Some cultures, for example, you don't look them in the eye. You never look them in the eye. And so it gets you to understand why when you consider some of these other things that go on in organizations. But let's dive a little bit further. Some of these statistics I'm sure you've seen, 50% of CISOs are looking to leave their jobs. To me, this is not surprising in a lot of organizations. And this is just true across the board, general throughout the industry. 50% of all industries, not just IT, not just security, just a general workforce thing, 50% of people are looking to leave their jobs anyway. What's more telling from my perspective is 25% of CISOs are looking to leave the industry altogether. So that should say something right there. That should speak volumes. I know a lot of CISOs who have left their positions and tried to go on and do other things, just as I have. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. So Ian's, some of you may have seen this as well, 67 to 75% CISOs are looking to switch their jobs. And here's the other interesting thing. From a lifespan perspective, 5.3 years is the average C-SPAN lifespan. But when you consider a CISO, it's an average of 2 years. Now, I know CISOs that have lasted a decade. I know CISOs that have lasted 4 months. I've seen everything in between. I've definitely lasted beyond the 2 years myself in some roles. But here's a bigger picture. Some of this I started to talk about. 70% of people don't want to become managers because they've never had a good manager. And I was reading a statistic on the way in as well. This is from a Forbes article that said 66% of managers are bullies. Let that sink in for a little bit. We don't have good management practices within our organizations for the most part. I can tell you the first time that I ever experienced great management, it's like they actually flew us out to another city in the US and they gave us management training for 3 days. I'm like, wow, this is fantastic. We don't invest in how to manage people properly. We don't train people on the dark triad. We don't train people on a lot of these things. So it's definitely a situation that we're trying to deal with. 50% want to leave their position. And CISOs, for reporting into a technical function, as I said before, we are that whistleblower. A lot of times they don't want to see it. They want to get their job done. That's all you want to do, get the job done. And we're coming in here and saying, we've got a little bit more work to do. I want to see all of us on the same page. We're trying to do something good, but that little bit is enough to send people over the edge. And the reality is too, as we heard about in the previous talk, a lot of CIOs and others are put in a really bad situation. The way I look at it is you've got kind of a pressure tank that CIOs are in. They don't have enough resources to get things done. Then they also don't have the resources to get things done from a security standpoint. So we're doubly creating more challenges if we're reporting into a technical function within organizations. And this I kind of said just before, but let's go into a lesson from Boeing. I thought Boeing, some of you may have heard me talk about this before, because I have talked about this in numerous settings, but I think Boeing is a really interesting case to take a look at. So we all know that Boeing had a stellar reputation in the industry. They had great work they were doing. They made sure their quality assurance was in place. What they were building, the planes, was phenomenal. And then all of a sudden, we started seeing several problems creeping up with airplanes over and over and over again. There was a great presentation that was out related to this, and they went through a deep dive on all the different issues and the challenges and the approach that was taken. When Boeing was founded, it was a technology-first company. It was all about having quality. So they implemented, like a lot of us are familiar with the CIA Triad, they had safety as a foundation of their equivalent of the CIA Triad. You had to have a safe plane. Well, MacArthur Douglas, when they came in, they had a different attitude. Let's make some money. We don't need to have all these safety checks. We don't need to have everything that's going on. Well, what happened in this presentation with Boeing, They said, hey, there's a problem. We need to shut down everything we're doing. We need to find out where the problems are and make sure we're not putting out a shoddy product. We don't feel comfortable about this. That person was yelled at, berated, et cetera. The list goes on from there. But essentially, they had to keep running despite all the problems that were going on. So ultimately, the QA function barely existed or existed in a very hobbling way, and it's really affected their reputation. A lot of people in IT are in that same situation. So it's very tough to kind of see where people are at when there's so much being demanded on both IT and security these days, because as we heard before, everything is changing very, very quickly. But I think safety is one of those things we have to stay on top of. So let's get into defining toxicity just a little bit here. I talked a little bit about the dark triad. So it is a combination of narcissism. So this is somebody like, hey, I'm wonderful. Did I ever mention I'm great? Oh, I'm so fantastic. We've all seen these, and I'm being a little cartoonish in there because there are much deeper considerations when you start to look at that, and we're going to touch on that in a little bit. There is psychopathy. So if you're not familiar with that, that is somebody who is a psychopath. You can almost feel certain times. Like I have dealt with enough psychopaths over the years, I have this sort of sixth sense when working with people who are psychopaths. You just kind of can feel it about them. So these are people that they don't care about stepping on you. You are a piece of garbage, you are a tool, they are going to use you as such. This is how they interpret the world. And then of course you have Machiavellianism. These are people who like to manipulate other people around you. I'm going to use the dark triad throughout this. There's the dark tetrad as well, which adds sadism. So keep in mind, this is not the only possible combination. And people could be a little bit narcissistic, but not psychopathic, and all kinds of things without going into the details. But a lot of times, you know, if we're a good person, we're trying to say, if somebody says, hey, they get pissed off at you, what do we do? Say, oh, I'm sorry. I had no intention of going in that direction. That's not what I meant to do. The dark triad doesn't operate that way. They are there for their own agenda. They are there to use you. They are there to step on you and create a lot of other problems. Now, when you start to talk about the dark triad, these are much more common up at the C-level positions. So I've seen some estimates that up to 12% or more that we're trying to handle that are up there in those C-level positions. They are drawn to power, the CEOs, the COOs. The larger the company, the more common they are because they are going for those positions. And there's a lot I can say about that because they tend to rise up the ranks pretty quickly because they know how to manipulate people. So just keep that in mind. They're not there to achieve mutual agreement. They're not there to align with you. Hey, how are you? They want to find out you, but only to discover what your weaknesses are in order to manipulate you against those weaknesses. Usually they don't apologize. They've seen one that has, but you know, it's like anything. Like somebody said, well, they don't apologize. Well, then they know that, then they say that, then therefore they're not dark triad. They're still a dark triad. They know what's going on behind that. But that's one of the other indicators. They don't apologize for anything. Their goals are very different than the types of things that you might be familiar with. They want to be in absolute control. They are control freaks. Where a lot of that comes from definitely comes from some either dark triad or narcissism or other sorts of things. A lot of times they want to destroy you, get you out of the company, all because you disagreed. Like that one person where I was like the best person out there and then the worst afterwards, he definitely had a lot of issues along these fronts. They don't have a conscience. They don't care that they are harming other human beings. And also keep in mind, you have to be very careful because anything you say or do, they are going to twist to meet whatever it is that they think is the right thing to do in order to manipulate you and change the situation. I've sat there and said, that is not what I said. You're misinterpreting those. But even that is going too much. And we're going to talk about how to resolve some of these issues in a little bit. So gaslighting, I think most of us have heard these types of things, but this happens when an abuser tries to manipulate the situation to present their own thoughts and feelings as truth. And this is a very real thing. They will come in and scream at you. They'll come in and like, hey, go ahead and do this. Just use your own judgment. Use your own judgment, and then you have that rug pulled out from underneath you because they're screaming at you because you weren't naturally aligned with them. Like, okay, well, these are very common issues too. Even if you try to get aligned, and which I've done before, even with knowing that they had these types of personalities, they still will twist it. And you think that you're able to use your own judgment. There's something called boiling the frog. This is another technique that they use. So it's very important to kind of consider what are the bigger things that we need to look at today. So it starts out very, very subtly. They will look at things from a very different context than most others. You know, I had mentioned like, hey, my wife and I, we went on this vacation, we did this, that, and the other thing. And so I made, and this is before I recognized who this person was. But the response that happened was, to me, very interesting and very indicative. I had made the mistake, my wife and I, every 5 or 6 years, we'll go to like a Halloween thing, and we had seen like a pumpkin patch, and they had like stuff out of Marvel and DC in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, all the different types of stuff. It was gorgeous, it was amazing. We heard such great rave reviews about this, we decided to go. So this is the response the manager had. It told me at that moment that something was really emotionally off with this person. He stood there. There are these things. They are called goths, and they have fingernails that are painted black that are this long. My brother really, like, whoa, alarm bells went off at that particular moment. This is a person who is not thinking about things in the same way that other people are going to be thinking about them. This is not somebody who is here to say, wow, that sounds fantastic, that sounds fun. These are the sorts of challenges that we have to deal with as CISOs at certain points in time. So that was his definition of subtlety, but to me, that just, because I have dealt with enough of the dark triad and similar traits that I get a sense of the people early, but some of them are going to start more subtly than others. They start with tiny things, this small little criticism here, a small little opinion here that's a little bit different. And then it grows over time. So generally what happens is, eventually the person who is being gaslit begins to discredit their own intuition because they start so subtly. And there's a lot of other reasons for that, which are going to come up as well. So classic bullying, I think everybody's aware of here. The person is doing the behaviors themselves. But the reality is it's much worse than that. Oftentimes they will enlist other people to do their bidding. And you think I'm joking about this, there are always the lackeys. For those of you who remember the American show, The Office, you know, what do you think Dwight was? He was a lackey. He was willing to go along with whatever the boss said. And so, but this is something that I have seen personally in reality. Well, they will go through and just do whatever they're there to lick the boots, but also go a little bit further. But a lot of times it's more subtle than that. They will play on things like racism. They will play on sexism. They will play on all these types of things. So definitely there's a lot of challenges. Then there's en masse. This is where, it's also called swarming, I can't remember if I have a slide on that or not, but where they get a bunch of people to do the same thing. And so some of the time, like you don't, and this is where there's definitely some challenges, because if somebody's like pissed off and they have a bad day, you don't jump in there right away and say, oh, I'm so sorry, or are things okay? If you start to push a little bit too much early on, they need a couple of cool down days. So when you're talking about it, sometimes though it's a little more subtle and they start to build up over a period of time because they're being manipulated by somebody who is dark triad and just happens to match those, especially when you're dealing with very poor cultures. And there's a lot that goes into cultures, and we're going to touch barely into that front. It's an area that I really dive into as well, but it's something important. But here's the interesting thing. Bullies tend to go after the strongest person. They go after the best person, the most knowledgeable one. Towards that end, some of you may have seen Phil Venables put out that don't fire me chart for CISOs. Because what do the good ones do? We're good at picking up the issues. We can see within 2 seconds what the issues are. Okay, we don't have policies, procedures. Oh, we've never done a vulnerability assessment. Or hey, the vulnerability assessment has been straight for 3 years. I can go on with example after example of those types of things that you can pick up on very quickly. But that's part of the problem. They're speaking up. And I think part of the reason that he wrote that is because they're afraid of getting fired as a result of the situation that people are in. And yes, you try to bring people around, but not everybody wants security on the team because we're in a sense, and this is going to be different, like there's something called the 3 lines model that's out there, and some people refer to the 3 lines defense and 5 lines and all kinds of things. And so there are other methods that are oftentimes used, but even those are problematic. For example, I know somebody, I won't say who, they had a report that needed to go out. He reported as a CISO into internal audit. He did not report into IT. I know in some cases, other organizations are structured a little bit differently. Well, he gave the report to internal audit because the internal audit asked for it. And what happened? That created a clashing, toxic situation throughout the entire organization. But of course, it was already toxic because the person in IT said, don't send that report out to anybody, don't give it to anybody, nobody should see that ever. That was the CIO talking. That's definitely concerning when you start to see those things. But they go after those strong people because their voice has power. Those that are hardworking, internally motivated, caring, honest, kind, all the best employees are being shoved out of organizations pretty quickly. Like that person that shut down Boeing, I think he was pushed out of the organization. So these are real world challenges that organizations have to face. I have a lot more to say on a lot of different things here, but let's go forward. Mobbing. This is basically a sustained collective effort to go after people. Now, like one of the people actually came up to me after one of the mobbing incidents that I was dealing with. And he said, well, I don't really feel that way. I was just told to do that by my manager. What? You know, these types of things go on quite often within information security. So you really have to take a look at those. You know, but those people are there because they don't want you for whatever reason. And usually has to do with biases that are built into their own being or biases that are built into other beings. Usually it's meant to get people out, you know, and it's meant to discredit or win it. But unlike isolated incidents, this is sustained collective effort over a long period of time. So it's definitely not a good situation. Then you have the smear campaign. These are all part of the tactics that are being used within organizations. And they know how to manipulate the organizations that are out there. They know how to work with HR, especially if you got the manager and you got all these types of situations. There are definitely a lot of challenges to deal with. So why does this behavior exist? A lot of it, I truly believe, it's your competence. They don't like it. They don't like your ethics. Like that one guy said something disgusting. I became a piece of garbage right after that. You spoke up about something. They did not want you to speak up about something. That means that in order to really work with them, you're going to need to sit down behind the lines and really work with them and try to get them on board with the conversations ahead of time. You challenge their ideas. In one case, I was talking to a CIO. He mentioned product A. I'm like, oh, product A is great. I also think we should look at product B. That was enough to incur another layer of wrath where he just stuck his tongue out at me for a minute angrily. I mean, these are very childlike behaviors that you see going on within people. Like I know there's an old British TV show, Man-Child. Kind of the same thing, but when you start talking about the dark triad, it is much worse than that. You outshine them in some way. People don't like that. I know that I think it was I saw this on a Netflix special about a manager, and there's like a corporation that had a lot of issues. You know, one of the laws is never outshine your boss. They're terrified of that. They're terrified of competence because your competence reflects what their failures are in a lot of those situations. They don't like heroes, you know, unless you're being a hero championing their cause and not anything else. So always trying to suck up to the boss, as it were. A lot of it is about fear of exposure, losing control. But a lot of it has to do with their own inner deficiencies within themselves. But sometimes it's, though, for personal gain. I happen to be talking, I'm going to call it a Fortune 1000 organization. But at any rate, in this particular case, there was a GRC program that was put into place. And big companies are all about accountability. But what happened is in this GRC role, security report on something saying, hey, it looks like IT only got 95% and somebody lost out probably on a pretty big bonus of probably tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. That pisses people off. You know, accountability is one thing, because accountability is one of those things, it's sort of a balancing act, because you go too strong on one side, it's going to really create a lot of problems. You go too lax, that too creates a lot of problems, because then you get a culture where you've got no accountability at all, and that's a big problem. You need to create the right level of accountability, the right desire to do things. So there are stages of corporate bullying. You know, there's identify the target. Usually they start to get jealous, or they start to develop their battle plans. Some sort of event sort of triggers things, and they kind of use that to move forward. Then there's the hidden battle that the victim oftentimes doesn't know about. This is where they're going to HR, they're doing all this kind of stuff in the background. You don't even know what's going on. And then you get the escalating attacks and the mobbing. That's where things start to get very damaging. Usually what happens is the CISO or others go resign, and then they cover up, and then they create their own metaphor for what actually happened. And it takes time to figure out. In one case, I didn't fully understand what had happened until I had left the organization. Because things started hitting me, bam, what happened? Bam, and it would hit. Like 6 months later, I kind of put the pieces together the first time I started encountering this. So part of the reason I'm teaching this is to make sure that you're at least aware of these types of behaviors so you can start to respond to them earlier on. So the impact of toxicity, you know, we've all seen these things. People hear the fight or flight, but there's some other options as well. People do freeze up, like, what do I do? Very common, fawning. And I've seen this, I've only seen this in a couple of cases, and I'm not the fawning type, but I've seen people, they're like, oh, yes, yes. And they just completely think that this person's strength means that they almost have some sort of elevated status. Now, there are certain people that that's going to appeal to. It doesn't appeal to me, but for some people, it definitely does appeal. And some people flop. They're unable to do anything. They sit there. They're hardly able to handle things. But when you start to take a look at this, you know, it can take up to 22 months to heal from a toxic workplace environment. So I know one CISO who has been through the ringer, definitely was not reporting into an IT function, so this is not an IT function only conversation, was reporting into I think a COO, if I remember right. Basically sitting on a beach. He's been doing that for 2 years. His own words, I can never trust another human being again. I can never trust another human being again. I feel for this person, for what's going on and stuff of what he had gone through. You know, I don't know, because I don't know any of the players or any of the context, but I suspect he was dealing with dark triad or something along those lines. Now, this is something I think is also very important. There's a lot of physiological responses that people have when it comes to looking at these things. People don't always realize it when they're in the middle of the situation and they try to treat it the status quo. They misread faces to be a little bit more negative. The middle ear actually adjusts to be less likely to understand other human beings around you. So we don't listen as well. The prefrontal cortex partially shuts down. It's where the fight or flight comes in. And it can, in a chronic situation, that prefrontal cortex can shrink by as much as 20%. This is a physical response to abuse. And all of this is legal, by the way. You know, if you go to HR, a lot of times this is going to be escalated if you're going to human resources. Because who's likely to sue? The abuser or the abusee? They're going to side quite often with the abuser. Now, I know companies that have an exception to this rule, but a lot of companies, they're going to side with the dark triad because they've already manipulated the situation, they've told their stories, all of these types of things. The brain is flooded with noradrenaline, so that definitely does focus us. And I can tell you, you get really hyper-focused, but you're exhausted by the end of the day. And the IQ goes down in relationship to the extent of the abuse. And I can tell you this. when you're dealing with situations like this, I was in one place, the organization was toxic. I won't say anything, but everybody I know has said this organization was toxic, that your brain starts to go down because of the general level of toxicity of the organization. So imagine you've got a general level of toxicity in the organization, which can also reduce your IQ, but then you're dealing with somebody above, dark triad, adding these additional layers of problems, your IQ goes down. So let's pretend you had a 120 IQ. It's now possibly an 80. You are not as smart as you think you are in those situations because you're trying to figure out, how do I protect myself? And your myopia starts to set in and you don't look at the big pictures the way that you need to. And many develop PTSD. So your defenses. So as leaders, as cybersecurity professionals, you have to be prepared. You are the cornerstone of management. And I know there's been a lot of issues with cybersecurity leaders that are out there. They do not want to look at the CISO, what I like to refer to as the Cheeto, the chief in title only. A lot of times CISOs are stuck in that particular situation where they have the responsibility without the authority. Very common issue. But you as a cornerstone manager, and that's starting to change today. I think boards and I think that senior business leaders are starting to change. And I see this, ironically enough, changing more in the small businesses more quickly than I'm seeing that in the larger businesses. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think that's an interesting factor. So yeah, 12%, I mentioned that before. But you're going to be dealing with the dark triad or similar people to the dark triad in a lot of the situations you're going to be dealing with. You're going to need to know how to manage the organizational politics, how to manage and deal with people who are going to not be on your side for a variety of different reasons. And a lot of this means that you have to be prepared. Because if you're not prepared, you're probably not going to survive. And it kind of puts this extra level of tensions with CISOs. Because quite often, and I know exceptions for organizations and not going to go down that route, but quite often, we're on the side of assurance. We are doing the assurance work, validating that things are in place the right way. We do a vulnerability check. Hey, do we have full patching? Great, you're doing Windows, and so I know IIS is also patched, but what about the enterprise application that's sitting on top of that? That function right there is assurance. Then we go to IT and say, hey, can you please get this done? I noticed that we had this gap, and there's a lot of different contexts for this, but you need to be prepared for what those responses are. You need to work with the people on a day-by-day basis to make sure that they're ready. So, where do you think it's most helpful to protect yourself on this workplace bullying chart? Anybody? Yeah, absolutely. Identify the target. That's why I like NIST CSF. And we're going to talk about that too, but you need to be able to understand this stuff. So listening to your intuition is very early. When I was younger, I used to love logic. Logic was like the way I approached the world. I got into that. I come from a philosophy background. My undergraduate degree, kind of funny enough, because I'm a big picture type of guy, was philosophy of social theory, integrating political science and economics, because I like to look at the big picture, because I think all of this stuff matters when you're in a corporate environment. But John is right, you need to be able to identify them very early. Many times we hear the expression, you've got two ears and one mouth. This is why. And a lot of times we hear oh yeah, I'm listening, and you kind of think, oh yeah, I got this. You see people like that. But the reality is, you may or may not have that. And that's why you need to be so thoughtful about the approach and protecting yourself. You really need to ferret out who these people are very early on. And for me, it's almost like a gut instinct around that. I can feel it around people who have these sorts of traits, and I feel that pretty early on. So I put this in here. I know everybody or most people here are coming in from a cybersecurity perspective, so I decided to use NIST CSF, yes, 1.0, 1.1, whatever, to really take a look at things here. So let's take a look about what you can do. How can you protect yourself in these situations? So get to know them. I've already said the 2 ears and 1 mouth. Ask questions. Don't make assumptions. Don't go out there and state things. You need to really, really listen to them. One thing that a lot of leaders don't do is we don't necessarily sweat the small stuff. The small stuff really does matter very early in your career. And especially if you're starting a new organization, you need to sweat the small stuff. You need to listen and understand. And there are certain things that you're going to need to stop right away, and certain things you just listen and you don't respond to, and you respond to at a later point in time. But you also really need to listen to that intuition. A lot of people talk about, what's company culture like? A bad company culture is the feeling you get in the pit of your stomach on Sunday night. If you're feeling that, there's probably a reason why, because the reality is people are aware of the context on an emotional level first before they're aware of it on a logical level. And so you really need to sit down and listen to that. So protection. A lot of this gets down to, once again, know thyself. What are your boundaries? What are the ethical boundaries? What are the challenges that you're going to have to deal with? How do you handle these types of things? Developing allies, I think, is one of those things as well. That if you want to protect yourself, you need to develop as strong of allies as possible, especially if you can before moving. Now, the challenge is, most of us, hey, we've got regulations, we've got 10 audits going on this year, we've got this, that, and the other thing. We don't have time to necessarily dive into all of this stuff in order to get it right. Most jobs are not set up that way. Most CISO positions are not set up that way. We're used to flying by the seat of our pants, and we have to do things. But the reality is, if we want to navigate organizational politics, we need to understand exactly what's going on. This is part of how we need to protect ourselves. I do think that it's important to get external help. You can get somebody, because I do some coaching as well, like me, but you can also go get a therapist or something like that. That, I think, is something that's very, very helpful, because they're going to help you interpret those signals which maybe you haven't figured out yet, or give you tools to try to figure out what exactly is going on. When I go into detection here, a lot of it is active listening. And this is another one of those things I think people don't fully understand when you talk about things like active listening. Oh, I'm listening, I get it, yeah. I heard what you said, and then they're yapping away with whatever's going on. And a lot of people operate that way. Active listening is something that is much deeper than that. We're talking about emotional intelligence skills with a lot of this stuff. So there's a great book, I'm forgetting the name of it right now, but it is about an FBI negotiator. And what he does is he talks a lot about, how do you sit down and negotiate with people? And a lot of it is about trying to get beyond bias. I was talking to somebody earlier today. Bias is important because we learn certain things, so we develop a bias, but everybody's got bias. It's both a positive and a negative, because we're blind to certain things, but we're aware of certain things at the same time. It isn't that bias is a bad thing. There are certain cases where it definitely can be, but when you're talking about active listening, what they do is they will get several people sitting down and listening to the negotiation. They're passing notes with one another so they can figure out what are the biases they have. And somebody's going to see something that you don't. That's the whole point behind a democratic process, because everybody's got something to bring to the table, but we have to listen to one another, and we have to see things through other people's eyes and really listen. And it's a difficult thing. Why am I thinking a certain thing? And that's a way of getting into active listening and getting beyond the bias. If possible, journaling. I think that any type of executive should be doing journaling. If you're a C-level executive, write it out, and I suggest on a piece of paper. There's something called the golden hour. You start early in the morning, you start up, and you start writing things down, because you start to think very clearly. Now, I like to exercise first because I'm a morning exerciser, so I do it a little bit later. But when you start to write things down, things become very clear, and it's like, you can oh, I didn't draw that conclusion. I didn't understand that context. Hey, I feel a certain way. Why did I feel a certain way? So journaling is an underrepresented form of how to protect yourself and a way to build emotional intelligence. People are not necessarily born being able to process these things. In IT, a lot of people come from an IT perspective. they don't think about emotional intelligence. They think, well, what's right, what's wrong? Okay, well, you got to flip this switch here, flip this switch here. Well, sometimes that can be a challenge to other people. And that's not something that a lot of people want to have. Good external help, once again, kind of the same thing as the protect, because the detection and that is all part of it. You know, getting that external help is extraordinarily valuable. And then there's response. There's a lot of different things you can do from a response perspective. Gray rocking. That's one of the techniques that's very good. But this is where you, especially if you're dealing with a narcissist or you're dealing with somebody like that, what do? You give very little information. Hey, this is true. Yep, got that done. It was handled. They don't have much to hold on to at that point. They can't twist your words into something else. Well, they always can. They can make up stuff, and I've seen that too. But it's one way of protecting yourself. It's not a pleasant way. Nobody enjoys doing that. And incidentally, I know somebody who was in PsyOps. If you're not familiar with the term, psychological operations, military trained, in order to manipulate other people. Somebody I know was dealing with a situation that was like this, and what happened? It took this person a year and a half to get the dark triad individual out. These are trained professionals who know how to handle situations, who are trained to manipulate other people, and it took them a year and a half. Now, I'm not going to tell anybody what to do under any circumstances. I don't know your context. I don't know the situation. I don't know how important your jobs are. But if your prefrontal cortex is going to shrink 20% as a result of the context you're in, I ask you, and I implore you to ask yourselves, is it worthwhile? And I think that's something that we all need to sit down, and when we're thinking about these situations, it might be, but it might not be. If it's going to take you 22 months to recover, is it worthwhile, or you should just leave and try to get a job someplace else, you know? And again, your context is going to be different from everybody else's, so there is no judgment from my standpoint. Stop the behavior. Like one thing I did with one individual, we were reporting into an interesting individual. I'll just leave it there. And this person was reporting underneath me. This is somebody underneath. People think the bullying comes from, oh, it's only the boss on the way down, and that's just how it is. It comes from your side, it comes from above, it comes from below. Well, this person was doing an end run around everybody. I was trying to explain even like, what is vulnerability management? What's a vulnerability? So then I used metaphor after metaphor. I'm explaining. I decided to use the logical way. I tried other things. This person couldn't even understand the A, B's, and C's of cyber. But I was an idiot because I couldn't explain it to this particular individual. So one of the things that we did is because we developed a good relationship, we are working with other people. We figured out what was going on because I was not the only target. A lot of times they're going to target multiple people within the organization. And we all got together and we went to the boss and said, look, we've got a problem here. Because I know that boss was looking at everybody like we're a bunch of idiots. You know, that we clearly don't know how to do anything. We don't know anything. We can't convince anybody of anything. And we had an intervention. We said, look, this is not right. Here's what this person is doing. Here's what we're seeing. This is not the sharpest knife in the drawer, and here's why. And nobody enjoys having those types of conversations. But it's because we sat down as a team and said, we've got a serious problem here, that we were able to get this person out pretty quickly. That person had hired a bad hire and brought them in and didn't have anybody else starting to take a look at them. So taking the time to listen, really listen. What does your emotion say about them? Like before making a hire, I actually will journal about them and say, what do I feel about them? I shred all that stuff as soon as I do it, but at least I try to get it out there. Say, if there's something that's irking me, what irks me about this particular person? Do I think this person is going to be a good hire? And a lot of times it's not about the good technical skills. It's about the emotional intelligence skills and sort of a blend of the two. I think that's extraordinarily important. But in some situations, if the context is too much and you've got that 80 IQ amongst you, consider leaving. That is an acceptable response. Not everybody likes to do that, but sometimes people are forced out or fired or other things because they don't recognize what that context is. Now, I briefly mentioned about human resources. Again, they're going to be part of that process, and you're already out anyway. Do you want to go through the effort of trying to jump through the hoops that are absolutely impossible going down that road? You know, it is definitely a challenge. And the recovery is stay healthy and get external help if you need to. Go talk to people. And I know, like, it's sort of interesting when you look at generations. Like, I'm Gen X. Trying to talk about mental health is not something that Gen X typically likes to talk about. It's not quite taboo, but it's sort of a step in that direction. But you talk to millennials, oh yeah, my therapist, I had my therapist, I had this, and they go around talking about things. And I will admit, I'm on the side, I tend not to go in that direction because I like to figure things out. I'm one of those people. I'm going to learn absolutely everything I can to try to figure out how do I resolve the situation. And how do I use my intuition? How do I better myself? I am a constant learner. I do not stop learning. But these are some of the best ways. And there's a million other ways too. I've got dozens and dozens and dozens of these types of recommendations for trying to manage toxicity within organizations. But at least some of these stories are going to be helpful for you. If you take this, go read about this, Never Split the Difference. That was a book about the FBI negotiator. It's a great book. If you haven't read it, pick it up and read it today. That was a book I was forgetting earlier. But these cover some of the basics from that perspective. So I did leave time. I want to thank everybody for your time today, but I did leave some time for questions.
And I thought you were talking about my situation, really. Not as a CISO, but as president of ISSA LA. I've had 2 different dark triad situations where they came after me, and it took all my intestinal fortitude to persevere, all my inner strength to remove the constant attack on my brain and to just move forward with my life, because it can be draining, as you said. It's like always there in the back of your mind, beating you. But I won't back down. I will not resign. I will fight on. I have fought. I have the support of my board. I had my support of my board previously. But these people, they're just relentless, and they're psychopaths. And there are people out there like that. But it's very difficult. I have to say that my upbringing in New York has helped me tremendously.
Sure.
My working out, playing football helped me. That discipline, that ability to just move forward. So discipline is important. Anyone who's done martial arts probably understands what I'm talking about as well. I never did that, but I had this other thing I could fall back on. You need something you can fall back on that you've done in your life previously to help you through these kinds of situations. But anyway, thank you for this. I identified with it, and it's good to hear this. Appreciate it.
I'm sorry you went through that, but thank you very much. Oh, you still are. My condolences.
So, I think we've all had the same type of experience. And, one of the things I've always tried to tell people is that someone else's bullying or bad day is probably for something outside of the situation at hand. And it actually, in fact, was in one of my cases where someone was having some issues at home or issues, personal issues, and they lashed out. And something like gray rocking is good because it kind of deflects a little bit. But I went up to that person a little later on and saying, listen, we got off on the wrong foot. If you ever need to talk outside of the situation, let's talk. And it actually went a really far way to change the situation, change the dynamic. And sometimes changing the dynamic brings a whole new level of a person you didn't know about. So I'd say, like with the bullying, it's always, there's some reason behind it. Maybe they're fearful, like you're saying, fearful for your job or fearful that they don't know as much as you. But sometimes it's something external to the situation altogether. So just keep that in mind, that somebody's bad day is something else.
Thank you. And I think that's a really good point right there, because there are some people who that's going to be very effective. And I love the story, especially if they just had a bad day. That's very different than somebody who is a consistent one. And so you have to look at the differences between that. I've done the same thing with people who are had a bad day, and I ignore the bad days. You just had a bad day. Let's try to create a deeper relationship. And that's the right thing to do. That does not work with somebody who is truly dark triad, typically speaking.
Yes, I wanted to ask you, how do we educate our kids? You know, now you're talking about the work, but for me, it starts at home. And right now, there is so many influences. All the kids have access to their phones, iPads, and everything. How do we prevent our kids from growing and becoming this with this behavior?
So years ago, I was on a board on childhood bullying, and it's a really tough thing. And when you start to look at things like the phones and things like that, it becomes an always-on situation. And so sometimes being able to just step away from it, like when I grew up, we did not have cell phones. We had the house phone, and that was it. I do think that education matters. I think that I know some corporations actually do teach about the dark triad. I think that education is part of it. But educate yourself, and then once you're educated, bring that on to your kids and start to talk about them. Like, I wish I would have known this stuff when I was 18. It's changed my approach to management. It's changed my approach to leadership. It's changed my approach to other things. And people don't really realize what's going on. Usually, like the kids, you know, our brains are not fully developed too. When we're, 16, 17, 18, we're trying to become more and more developed. And so there's some challenges there, but it's something, if you at least educate them, they may not fully get it or fully understand it, but I would say try to work with them to understand what the deeper context is and understand why this stuff matters and why to have the appropriate level of communication with people and understand that people do have a lot of sensitivities. There are a lot of very sensitive people that are out there. So one of the trainings that I went to years ago I thought was very interesting, and this is very early on in my career. They had like this test that went on, and they were saying, "Oh, where are you at?" And they started asking questions. Because I came from an IT background myself, and it just, this really hit me. Somebody said, "Well, what if somebody walked by you and didn't say hello? What would you think?" Like, I don't care. I just literally, because you've got your stuff going on. I literally don't care, because I don't expect everybody to really bow down and worship me. But somebody else said, "I would be devastated if somebody walked by me and didn't say hello." Their whole world would be completely shattered by looking at things in a different perspective. And that really woke me up early on, because wow, what I say really does matter. And then I took the extra effort to say hello and work with other people. And even if it's like, hey, I've got something else in my mind, when I'm around other people, I try to be a little bit more friendly, a little more open and things like that. So I would take a look at small things like that and try to educate your children along those routes. But first by becoming educated yourself and telling stories. Be real, be a little bit vulnerable. I do know that doesn't always work with kids because it doesn't resonate. They're not quite there yet. But do what you can and what makes sense for your context.
Yeah, so I mean, the numbers or percentages you showed are alarming, because CISO role is important role, and if people are resigning, or moving out of the industry, are there any those advisory companies like Gartner or these auditing companies they are doing about this and trying to coach the board or raise an alarm like for them that they need to look at it and they need to identify these kind of people in their organization to keep their organization healthy?
I know there's some grassroots movement. I don't and haven't fully explored all of the types of companies that are doing that. I do some tests on the cultural front, and a lot of this I think boils down to trust with individuals. And you've got to ask yourself, if there is a very low trust with these, and I've seen these, like some companies as well will do different types of tests to kind of go check on these things. But if there's low trust, why is there low trust? And you've got to sit down and ask those. I don't have a solid answer for you for the companies that are doing that, but I think that it's an important question. But that's some of what I have seen that's out there, and I know it's something that people are trying to change.
I think that's it. Jay?